history nerds and historians. My name is Krystina, and this is Effed Up History. This is where we talk about a little tidbit from history that's super fucked up. So today is part 2 of my Tudor series, where we will be talking about Henry VIII's second wife, Anne Boleyn. So last week, in case you missed it, we talked about Catherine of Aragon, as well as a little bit about the early life of Henry VIII, his father, Henry VII, and then Catherine's parents a little bit, which were Isabella of Castile and then Ferdinand II of Aragon. If you missed it, go back. We're going to be referencing it every now and then, and I don't want you to miss out and be kind of lost. But I mean, this is sort of like a standalone story, so if you don't know all the details, you could probably still understand it anyway, but I do suggest going back and listening to that. Trigger warning before we begin: divorce, miscarriage, execution, and rants about historical fiction that people think is fact. So without further ado, sit back, relax, and practice your, oh good God, what the fuck faces. So, Anne Boleyn is a very difficult historical figure. There is a lot written about her. There are a lot of people who study her. There are a lot of people who speculate about her. But there is not a lot of history that's actually from Anne Boleyn. The website historicplaces.org says, quote, Anne has left behind virtually nothing of her own voice, and all of the histories of her life are marred by the writer's prejudices or leaps of imaginative fantasy. Even the simplest statements about her are difficult. So again, we talk about the whole silence and erasure thing that we talked about in the last episode. Anne is also very much a victim of propaganda. There were a lot of people who didn't support her because they didn't support England's split from the Roman Catholic Church. And that's reflected in a lot of writings that are about her. We don't even know what she looks like. And I'm sure that you're all like, Krystina, there are portraits of her. We know what she looks like. No. So I will have you know, Bartholomew, I don't know. your names are all Bartholomew now. I will have you know that most of the portraits that we see are not contemporary portraits of Anne Boleyn. Many of them were made during Elizabeth I's reign. There is one portrait of her that is a lead portrait, but it's been damaged mainly in the nose area. So a very big part of her face is gone. And then there are a couple others, but those are not very realistic. One of them is a sketch that was done for the seating plan at her coronation feast. And it's literally just a happy face sketched on it. It's hilarious. And then the other one that I could find reference to is in the Black Book of Garter, which is also fairly cartoony. So if we want to dive into trying to speculate what she looked like, if you look at contemporary records of people writing about how she looked, most people said that she was beautiful. One record said that she was beautiful enough. So maybe this is one of the ones of people who didn't really care for her. She's described as having darker complexion than the very white complexions that it's seen as a trait of beauty during this time. She has dark hair, dark eyes that were enticing and drew people in. She's also regarded as eloquent and graceful and cheerful. So mostly positive descriptions of her, except the description that was done by Nicholas Sander, who describes her as tall with black hair, an oval face, and a sallow complexion, which relatively corroborates with what I just said. But then he continues and he says that she had a projecting tooth, that she had 6 fingers on her right hand, she had a wen on her chin, which I had to look that up. It's a large growth. And he said that she wore a high neck to cover this wen because she was very self-conscious of it. And in fact, doing this brought the high neck dresses into fashion, which is not accurate. But other than that, she was relatively handsome with a pretty mouth. So, great. These descriptions that make her seem kind of deformed are not founded in history. They're obviously not corroborated by the other descriptions. Nicholas Sander was also a child when she died, and he most likely never saw her. But most importantly, why we can't believe anything that he says is that he was a Catholic that was very, very against the Protestant Reformation. And he was very, very against Elizabeth I. And he was writing during her reign. So he was trying to blacken the name of Elizabeth I and her parents. And he even said, like, in this same writing that Henry VIII fathered Anne Boleyn when he slept with her mother, which, I mean, like, he would have been 9 or 10 when that happened, because she was born most likely in like 1500 or 1501. So yeah, just don't trust anything that has to say. He also says some other things which we'll touch upon a little bit later. So a little bit more background about her, because now that we've established we don't really know what she looks like, other than that she had dark hair and dark eyes and was maybe a little bit tan. Her parents were Thomas Boleyn. He was the Earl of Ormond and Wiltshire. And then Elizabeth Boleyn, whose maiden name was Howard. Now, she was the daughter of Thomas Howard, the Earl of Surrey, that we talked about briefly in the last episode. He was the one who led the battle against James IV at the Battle of Flodden under Catherine of Aragon's command. There is this perpetuating story, mostly from the like book/movie The Other Boleyn Girl by Philippa Gregory, that the Boleyns were plotting, that they were always trying to climb the political social ladder and use their children as pawns. But this doesn't seem to be the case. Thomas Boleyn already had titles. Elizabeth Boleyn was relatively respected because of her father and her family. And there are multiple records that suggest that they didn't actually support Anne's eventual marriage to King Henry, and that they didn't support, which we'll talk about in a moment, like one of their other children having a romantic affair with him. They didn't support that either. So we'll talk about more about that in a second. But we don't know when Anne Boleyn was born. Like I said, she was probably born around 1500, 1501. There are some sources that say that she could have been born as late as 1507, but I'm more inclined to say like 1500, 1501 for a number of reasons. The first one is that in 1513, she was sent abroad for her education under Margaret of Austria as her maid of honor. But this position isn't something that would be given to a 6-year-old, but it would be something that might be given to like a 12 or 13-year-old. So to give a little bit of background very briefly about Margaret of Austria, because she's awesome. Last episode, we talked about Philip of Castile, who married Catherine of Aragon's sister, Juana, and they were kind of like fighting with Ferdinand II over the ruling of Spain. So Margaret of Austria was Philip's sister. So she was the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor, and she had a lot of sway. In 1507, Margaret of Austria was named the governor of the Low Countries, which were the Western European and coastal countries of like Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. And then in 1509, she was elected its ruler, and was the only woman that was ever elected for this position, which is super, super cool. So she was a very strong female presence to be around in like rather formative years for Anne. In 1515, Anne left Margaret of Austria's court and went to France to join Queen Claude's court. So Queen Claude was the wife of Francis I, and Anne Boleyn most likely stayed with her for 6 or 7 years. She became very fluent in French. When she came back to England after the 6 or 7 years, people remarked that she may have been too French, that maybe spending all this time in France had changed her too much. When she was called back to England in 1521, it was to settle a dispute, but not like settle a dispute with training that she may have gotten being like a well-respected member of the court or anything. No. That's not a woman's job in the 1500s. No. So what had happened was her family had her father was having a land dispute with this other man. So Anne Boleyn was summoned back from France. And the way that she was going to help settle this dispute was she was going to marry a man named James Butler, which was coordinated by Cardinal Wolsey. But this didn't happen. Why didn't this happen? Maybe because someone with more power took notice of her. So it is said that she had like other romantic interests at this time, but nothing really panned out. We'll get to that a little bit later. Henry Percy was like a big one that a lot of people still speculate about even today. But according to all of the records, nothing happened between them. And in 1526, according to most sources that I've read, Anne Boleyn came to court and she became a lady in waiting to Catherine. Now, according to one of the documentaries I watched, and contrary to how it's portrayed in the Tudors, Henry was only known to have had 2 affairs at this point, and one of them was the mother of his illegitimate child, Henry Fitzroy. Her name was Bessie Blount. We talked about her very briefly last episode. And the other was his mistress in like 1525-ish, and that was Anne's sister Mary. But there honestly isn't like much information about their affair. It could have been a one-night stand or like a relatively short-lived affair. It most likely wasn't long and drawn out like it's portrayed in The Other Boleyn Girl. Apparently she caught Henry VIII's eye on her wedding day. Honestly, that worked better for him. It worked in his favor, because if she was married, then if she were to get pregnant, it would be assumed that the father was her husband and not King Henry VIII. So it was speculated, and it is still speculated, that 2 of her children were actually fathered by Henry VIII, and those 2 children were sons, which I'm sure made Henry VIII super happy. But it was fine, because after that he started going for Anne, which I'm sure made Mary super happy. So just to sort of like add one last comment about Mary Boleyn, because we don't really talk about her much more after this. Like I said, her parents didn't really seem to approve of her affair with King Henry VIII. Later on, she married someone else. I think his last name was Carey. And when he died and she was left a widow, King Henry VIII actually had to step in and tell Thomas Boleyn, like, hey, you need to take care of your daughter because she's been left destitute and like she's gonna die. So you should probably like take care of her. I don't care if you don't like the choices that she's made in life, but she's still your daughter, and I as the king am commanding you to do this. She also didn't really have that much of like sway with King Henry VIII. In The Other Boleyn Girl, it's made it seem like she has a lot of sway with him, and that just doesn't really seem to be the case either. So yep, that's the story about Mary Boleyn. She's sort of like a hidden figure. The Anne Boleyn Files and Tudor Society, I think, is the channel that's on YouTube. It's hosted by a woman named Claire Ridgway, who kind of has like spent the better part of the last few years just engrossed in studying Anne Boleyn. She has like a whole series about Mary Boleyn. I think that if you're more interested in learning about her story, definitely go watch those videos. They're very, very insightful, but that's not my specialty. Today we're talking about Anne. So we don't know how Anne felt about this like affair with her sister. We don't know how Anne even really felt about Henry VIII. I speculate that she wasn't really for it at first. Now, whether that's because of her sister or because she was trying to ensure a proper match for herself, or maybe because she didn't want to be mistress but wanted to be queen. For me, the third one is what a lot of people say, but I'm not totally convinced by that argument, because in 1527, she actually left court and she seemingly cut a lot of contact with Henry VIII. We have 17 letters that were written from Henry to Anne between her leaving court around May of 1527 to October 1528 the next year. And I think I'm planning on releasing, a bonus episode where I read some of these letters, because they're really interesting. So stay tuned. But the first letter that we have that he wrote right after she left around May of 1527, I will read a little snippet of, because it seems to me that she may have rejected him. So it reads, quote, "In turning over in my mind the contents of your last letters, I have put myself into great agony, not knowing how to interpret them, whether to my disadvantage, as you show in some places, or to my advantage, as I understand them in some others, beseeching you earnestly to let me know expressly your whole mind as to the love between us two." Later in this letter, he says it's absolutely necessary that he knows how she feels, and that he's been in love with her for over a year, not knowing how she feels in return. And he promises that if she accepts him, that he will shirk away all other mistresses and he will devote himself only to her. Even though he's still married, it's fine. He will only devote himself to her. In later letters, he sort of chastises her for not writing to him. He sends her gifts. One of them was like a deer that he killed, and he was like, "Oh, imagine the hunter as you consume this and think of me fondly." It's bananas. He even signs some of the letters with her initials with like a heart around it, or like A+H with a heart around it, like a little schoolboy, like, "Oh, Anne and Henry number 4 ever." He also writes that he's been stricken with the dart of love. He says, "My heart and I surrender ourselves into your arms." He says that he dreams of being, quote, "in his sweetheart's arms, whose pretty duckies I trust shortly to kiss." Duckies means boobs. So Henry VIII was a boob guy. That's something that I now know. So now that's something that you need to know as well. Now, Anne did seem to respond to some of these letters, but we don't have those responses to know exactly what she said. But again, it seems like she was still trying to distance herself by reading those letters. As of July of 1527, he writes that he heard that she doesn't want to come back to court, and he asks her for a response. And she either doesn't give it, or we just have lost her response to history, because the next letter that we have on record from him isn't until months later in February of 1528. He basically tells her that he's seeking annulment, which we know from the last episode in April. That's when he first mentions the divorce court with Catherine. And he mentions, like, I mentioned a conversation that we had that she was demanding that it brought before a judge. So in February, he was most likely starting to have these conversations with her. After this, we don't have another letter on record until June. And that is when the letters become a lot more frequent, because Henry finds out that Anne is sick with the sweating sickness, and he's concerned about her. Although in the first letter of this series in July 1528, he does mention that he might be sicker with the disease of absence or whatever. But he did send his second best doctor to her to try and heal her, which a lot of people who didn't read the full context of the letter scoff at. But he says that his best doctor is out of town, so he was sending the best that he could send her. And after this, the letters sort of start to take on a different tone. And in like total speculation on my part, maybe because he was so concerned about her and her well-being and did everything possible that he could on his part to take care of her and her family. Maybe, possibly, again, speculation on my part, she realized that these feelings weren't just lustful, but that he actually did care about her. I mean, again, we'll never really know why, because we don't have her responses. And people like to think that, and like with not having these responses, people sort of like project their own emotions onto her. So I just like projected my own opinions onto her and saying that like maybe this is how she thought. Other people are not as kind. They think that she's this like manipulative harlot and homewrecker who knew exactly what she was doing and would do anything that she could to become queen. I mean, that's certainly like what's perpetuating the other Boleyn girl again. But I don't think personally that that's the case. It doesn't seem like she walked into court and was like, "You know what would be cool? If we split with the Roman Catholic Church and messed up a lot of our political relationships because I just want to be queen by any means possible. And also I'm a psychopath or a sociopath or whatever." I mean, these terms don't exist. It is 1520. Like maybe at first it was lust on King Henry VIII's part, and like maybe at first it was this desire to have sons or whatever. And there is that alleged comment that Henry made in later 1528 that he would pick Catherine again if he could. So maybe Anne wasn't the love of his life, but I think that there actually could have been love there. Like I think at one point they actually did care about each other and actually did love each other. At least that's what it seems from their talking back and forth. I mean, chivalric love was really big during this time, so it could just be that Henry VIII was playing the part and he was just like addicted to that new relationship energy, and then once that sort of wears off, he would just find whatever's new. I mean, that could definitely be a possibility as well. But again, that's projecting feelings on people that are historical figures that we don't really know how they feel. So the only evidence that we have of Anne's response is in Anne's Book of Hours at the British Library. So in her Book of Hours, Henry wrote to Anne in French, so this is translated, quote, "If you remember my love in your prayers as much as I adore you, I shall surely never be forgotten because I am yours. Henry Rex always." And this was written on the page depicting the Man of Sorrows, which many believe was his way of saying that he was like absolutely lovesick for her. Anne's response to him was, quote, "By daily proof you shall me find, to be unto you both loving and kind." And she had written this on the page that depicts the Virgin Mary being told by the angel that she will give birth to a son. And many historians believe that this is Anne Boleyn's way of saying that she will love him on her own terms and she will give him a legitimate son and heir. She didn't want to be mistress. She wanted to be wife and queen, and she'd be willing to wait for it if she had to. According to a timeline constructed by Claire Ridgway of the Anne Boleyn files that I mentioned with like the Mary Tudor videos, in 1528, Anne acquires a copy of The Obedience of the Christian Man and How Christian Rulers Ought to Govern by William Tyndale. And this book states a lot of things, but basically states that rulers were not accountable to the Pope, but to God directly. Now, this is the same year that Henry started really pushing hard for that divorce, and that he started that smear campaign against Catherine, saying that she had an STD and all of that. And then after the divorce hearing in 1529, June of 1529, Anne was apparently very upset with how it turned out. Again, we don't know for sure because we don't have letters from her, but I read and I heard in documentaries that she became very angry and she sort of went on the attack a little bit. So Catherine was still queen. Like I mentioned last time, she still, sewed his shirts and ruled over court and all of that. But Henry started spending more and more time with Anne, and Anne started trying to sort of test her power a little bit. So she stopped letting Catherine's courtiers come to her. And then Anne had some of her women become ladies in waiting to infiltrate Catherine's spaces and sort of act like spies. From what I gathered, Catherine tended to only keep Spanish servants around her because Catherine liked to speak in Spanish a lot. She very much held on to that Spanish identity of hers. And then Anne sort of like took some of these ladies out and put her own in to try and figure out what was happening, what they were saying. Around this time, the Boleyn family were actually blaming Cardinal Wolsey for a lot of the events that were holding everything up. And they were blaming him for like not stepping in. They felt like as a cardinal that he should have the rights to just annul the marriage if he wanted to annul the marriage. He was the most powerful clergyman in England. And they felt that it was within his power to push that divorce forward, especially with what they read in the Tyndale book that I mentioned. So eventually, to make his mistress happy, Henry began stripping Wolsey of his power and property, which is not how you get someone on your side. And in autumn of 1530, Wolsey died after being arrested. So Henry was starting, if it isn't like obvious at this point, to become more and more tyrannical. There's a sketch by Horrible Histories where they like parade out everyone that Henry was friends with towards the end of his reign, and like all of them have been people that he's like executed or arrested and died in prison, or like arrested after he treated them poorly. So I think about that a lot, like every time I research Henry VIII. I'll see if I can find a link and put it in the description, but spoilers, like if you don't know the story, I'd probably wait until the end of this series if this is your first introduction to like real Tudor history. In the last episode, I mentioned that in 1531, he began the English Reformation without like fully realizing it. And this was because that was the year that Henry began making the moves to be recognized as sole protector and supreme head of the English church and clergy so far as the law of Christ allows. I also mentioned in the last episode that on July 11th, 1531, Catherine and Henry meet for the last time before she was moved to Moor Palace at Hertfordshire. When they were like meeting towards the end of their marriage, he was actually like trying to get her to join a nunnery, but she was like, "No, I'm not joining a fucking nunnery, dude." So I forgot that in the last episode that he tried to get her to join a nunnery, which I think is pretty interesting. It's very Hamlet of him, like, get me to a nunnery. But anyway, yeah, so that was the last time that they met. And from then on, Anne was pretty much acting as queen consort. She obviously wasn't married to him, so she wasn't actually queen consort, but she did accompany him on various trips, including her old stopping grounds in France in October 1532. She was probably brought because she had that connection and he was trying to make peace with France at that time. And it is said that on that trip in 1532, Anne and Henry had sex for the first time. On January 25th, 1533, the King of England became a bigamist when he married Anne. No mistress had ever married a King of England before, and she was the first. And this was very exciting for a lot of people. And soon after, she was pregnant, which was also exciting for a lot of people, although maybe she was pregnant a little bit beforehand, but I'm not going to judge. And then about 2 months later, like I mentioned in the last episode, a man named Thomas Cranmer becomes Archbishop and officially annuls Catherine and Henry's marriage, and then retroactively approves the marriage of Anne and Henry, and she was crowned queen in June. So according to this new Church of England that was in the process of being established, he was officially married to Anne and divorced from Catherine, but to the Catholics who lived in England and the rest of Europe, their marriage was not legal. She was still the mistress, and any future children that they had would not be legitimate. Like the one that was born on September 7th of 1533. So on September 7th, 1533, Anne went into labor and gave birth to a beautiful and happy and healthy baby girl. Oh, they named their daughter Elizabeth after both of their mothers, but I was like, girl, this ruined everything. It frustrated Henry so much. He annulled his marriage and went through all of that shit to get rid of Catherine of Aragon. And he got so excited when Anne got pregnant so quickly. And it's another girl. And even the astrologers told Henry that it would be a boy. He had announcements printed about the birth of his sons. He was going to have a manly tournament to announce the birth of his manly son. And that, of course, had to be canceled. We can't have a tournament for a girl. But once that sort of initial disappointment wore off, he actually really did love Elizabeth. And then another positive side of this is that it showed that Anne could have healthy children. Catherine had given birth multiple times before she had her one healthy daughter. And this was Anne's first pregnancy. So they were already off to a better start than his first marriage, at least according to Henry VIII. The Church of England was officially established in March 1534 with the Act of Succession, where the subjects of England were ordered to accept the king's marriage as, quote, undoubted, true, sincere, and perfect, and that all of their future children would be legitimate and their children would be lawful heirs to the throne. And then an additional statute was passed that broke most of those financial ties with Rome. And in November of 1534, the Act of Supremacy was passed, which, just like that book by Tyndale stated, said that Henry had always been the supreme head of the Church of England, but left out the phrase as far as the law of Christ allows. So even without Christ's approval, he was the head of the Church of England. They seemed to be extremely happy for the next 2 years, even though it said that she had a miscarriage in the summer of 1534. In October 1535, she did get pregnant again, so things were starting to look up for her again. Hopefully for Henry, this wouldn't be like it was with Catherine, because she had had so many miscarriages and babies die and only had one child that survived to adulthood. And he was hoping that, just the one miscarriage. Miscarriages weren't super uncommon. So hopefully this was just sort of like a fluke. And she could go back to having healthy babies and having healthy sons. And she could be the wife that always mattered and the wife that he truly cared about. And everything that he did to tear apart England would be worth it. And then 1536 came. According to Claire Ridgway, in January 1536, Henry noticed a woman in the court named Jane Seymour. She is important. Remember her name. So as we discussed in the last episode, Catherine of Aragon died on January 7th, 1536. I'm again going to repeat the quote from Eustace Shapley in case you forgot it, or in case you didn't listen to the last episode, that talks about Henry's reaction to the news. Again, Shapley is someone who did not support Anne Boleyn, so when he calls her the concubine and their child the bastard, it's what I'm talking about, that difference between the Protestant beliefs and the Catholic ones. Regardless of these acts of succession or supremacy and what they told the subjects they had to believe, it wasn't at all what everyone believed. As seen in this quote, that again, I said in the last episode, but Eustace Shapley had written this to Charles V of Spain, and it said, quote, "You could not conceive the joy that the king and those who favor his concubinage have shown at the death of the good queen," meaning Catherine, "especially the Earl of Wiltshire and his son, who said it was a pity that the Princess Mary did not keep company with her." The king, on the Saturday he heard the news, exclaimed, quote, "God be praised that we are free from all suspicion of war," and that the time had come that he would manage the French better than he had done hitherto, because they would do now whatever he wanted from a fear lest he should ally himself again with your Majesty Charles V, seeing that the cause which disturbed your friendship was gone. On the following day, Sunday, the king was clad all over in yellow from top to toe, except a white feather he had in his bonnet, and the little bastard, meaning Elizabeth I, was conducted to mass with trumpets and other great triumphs, and after dinner the king entered the room in which the ladies danced, and there did several things like one transported with joy. Wonderful guy. On January 24th, 1536, Henry VIII had that tournament that I mentioned. He was jousting. He was in love with jousting. It was his favorite sport. And although he didn't have a son yet, he used jousting as a way to sort of like show the world that he was manly. There's like probably some joke there between like the size of a jousting lance and like the size of a penis. I'm not going to go there today. Use your imaginations or like come up with your own jokes. Message me the best ones and I will put them in future episodes. But one of the passes of this jousting knocked him off of his horse, and it was bad. So I love going to Renaissance fairs, and I've even worked at some Renaissance fairs, and a lot of Renaissance fairs that I went to would do joust games where they would go for like a target or precision training where they would try to get their lance through like a ring or something like that. But there was one Renaissance fair that I would attend when I was living in Florida, and it's actually the first one that I ever worked at. That is the Sarasota Medieval Fair. I love it. It's my favorite Renaissance fair that I have been to. And at that fair, one of the things that made me love it so much is that they performed actual jousting. It wasn't precision training or anything like that. It was actual jousting. And the reason why this was the one of few that did actual jousting is because actual jousting is fucking dangerous. I was talking to some of the people who did this, and at one point, one of them said that the impact of a full hit in which you fall off of your horse is like taking the entire brunt of a car crash, often to your chest, and it could be fatal. And if it wasn't fatal, it can cause lifelong physical traumas. In Henry's case, it knocked him unconscious for 2 hours, and when he woke up, allegedly, he was different. 5 days after this jousting incident on January 29th, Anne suffered a miscarriage. She said that it was due to the stress of hearing about what happened to Henry and worrying about his well-being. Unfortunately, the fetus had developed enough for them to see that it would have been a boy. In my notes, I just have written here, insert rant about how Henry VIII is a fucktard for celebrating his first wife's death. And if he hadn't done that and had been an actual fucking decent human being about arguably the only woman that he ever loved, he probably would have had a fucking son by now and could have just shut the fuck up about it already. I mean, I don't think I need to insert a rant. I think that those notes speak for themselves. So with this miscarriage that she had on January 29th, 1536, this also brings up the question that a lot of people think is fact, is that this miscarriage was actually a deformed fetus. So this is in the Other Boleyn Girl. Other Boleyn Girl says that her baby was, quote, horribly malformed with a spine flayed open and a huge head twice as large as the spindly little body, which Philippa Gregory probably based off of one account that said, quote, the time had not come when Anne was to be again a mother, but she brought forth only a shapeless mass of flesh. But this was written by Nicholas Sander, the same one who hated Elizabeth and Anne and said that she had 6 fingers and a one on her chest, on her throat, chin, whatever, etc., right? Actual contemporary sources, even by Eustace Chapuis, who is not a fan, said that she had given birth to a totally normal child, most likely around 15 weeks. And some accounts even say that the child was beautiful. So it's believed that the only reason this deformed fetus thing continued is because it supports the also untrue argument that she committed incest or adultery or that she was a witch. Unfortunately, not only did this miscarriage mean that Henry was upset about not having a living son, but he blamed Anne for it. And it was honestly probably the beginning of the downfall of their marriage. And when Anne started arguing with Thomas Cromwell in the spring, and he started seeing her as a threat, that probably did not help either. So on April 2nd, 1536, Anne instructed her almoner, who was like a church officer who would distribute money to the poor. His name was John Skip, and she instructed him to give what would later be regarded as a controversial sermon about Haman in the Bible, who was an advisor who tried to corrupt his king, but was thwarted by the king's loving wife, which was interpreted as a direct attack towards Thomas Cromwell. So I didn't really talk too much about Cromwell last time because he plays a much bigger role in the story of the Annes, being Anne Boleyn and then Henry's fourth wife, Anne of Cleves. So we don't really know much about Thomas Cromwell's early life. I gathered from the research that I did around 1520, he started working with Cardinal Wolsey as a solicitor, which is basically someone who gives like legal advice and counsel. He helped dissolve some of the smaller monasteries early in his career, which made a lot of the public not like him. But Cardinal Wolsey really liked him. And then Cromwell rose in status even more and became a confidential advisor to Wolsey. And Wolsey sort of had like his downfall, like when that happened, that we talked about in 1529 and 1530. Cromwell entered the court with this reputation and being a confidential advisor to the king, along with a slew of roles. And like I mentioned briefly in the last episode, he's believed to have been one of the main advisors who was like, hey, Henry, if you don't like what the Pope is saying, you can tell the Pope to go fuck himself. And then poof, English Reformation, right? So Thomas Cromwell was a politician who came from nothing and built himself into the man that he was. And something that's still relatively common with self-made people today is this sense of pride, and sometimes maybe a little arrogance, and sometimes maybe a little bit of ruthlessness. So I kind of went back and forth about how I wanted to retell this next part of our historical account, and I honestly think the best way to do it is to tell it from Anne's perspective. So after Anne recovered from her miscarriage in the spring of 1536, she returned to court and tried to focus on getting pregnant again and getting back to her queenly duties, which apparently includes attacking Thomas Cromwell, when seemingly out of nowhere she was arrested on May 2nd of 1536 and taken to the Tower of London. And she had absolutely no idea why she was arrested at all. On May 15th of 1536, she was taken in for her trial, and she still didn't know what the accusations were. Like, imagine being arrested and sitting in jail. I mean, she wasn't in like a jail cell, but she was in the Tower of London. She was detained in the Tower of London for almost 2 weeks, being brought to trial and not even knowing what the accusations are, not being able to like build up a defense for yourself, just like being arrested and then like getting plopped into the courtroom and being like, surprise accusations, everybody. What do you gotta say for yourself, ma'am? Like, this is ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. So on May 15th, like I said, she was brought into King's Hall in the Tower of London before the judge, who was her uncle, and then 26 men who were to be her jury and about 2,000 spectators. But not present in the courtroom was her husband, Henry VIII. If she was arrested, he knew why she was arrested. He most likely sent out the order for her arrest, or was at least privy to it, and it was sent with his permission, but he wasn't in the room. Because if we think about the last time Henry VIII was in a courtroom with his wife, that was in June of 1529 when he had that divorce court with Catherine, which we will remember did not end well for him at all, and Mr. VIII was not going to let that happen again. So as Anne is standing before these 27 men and approximately 2,000 onlookers, the charges are read out to her, and we can finally know what the fuck these accusations are. So the charges read that she had been married to Henry for 3+ years, quote, despising her marriage and entertaining malice against the king, and following daily her carnal lusts, she did procure by base conversations and kissings, touchings, and gifts many servants to be her adulterers and concubines. On the 6th of October, she did procure Henry Norris of Westminster, gentleman to the Privy Chamber, to violate her. They had illicit intercourse on many occasions, and she did also, on the 2nd of November, incite her only natural brother, George Boleyn, to violate her, alluring with her tongue into George's mouth and George's tongue into hers. So there we have it. Treason, adultery, and Frenching your brother, also known as incest, and something that is super gross. So how the fuck did we get here? This is insane. What kind of stuff is Anne Boleyn plotting behind the scenes? What kind of person is she, and what is she doing at court? Like, I know we say that she's kind of a hidden figure, but like, damn. Now, something to kind of touch on about the background of maybe some of these accusations. Court was a very interesting place. So there was a practice called courtly love, which was basically like a ton of flirting and sexual innuendos, and court just became this like hotbed for sexual tension. And it was supposed to be relatively innocent, but you really couldn't know at the end of the day whether people were just flirting or whether it like had progressed into fucking. And Anne was very good at the practice of courtly love, which was fine when she was a mistress. It's probably one of the things that got Henry's attention in the first place. And now as queen, it was expected for her to participate in courtly love. She was the head of court. She was expected to be what the men of court desired. She was expected to take compliments and flirt back, but she had to flirt without insulting Henry VIII, and the flirting could never devolve into anything more. But this courtly love was her downfall. So again, we're seeing a repeat with Henry VIII, that the very things that he falls in love with his wives in the beginning eventually becomes the thing that he despises in them. So with Catherine, she was very strong-willed. She was very headstrong. She knew what she wanted. She was a fighter. She was a warrior. And Henry, who loved this at first, began despising her for that. He began putting out a smear campaign against her, trying to put her in her place and push his dominance onto her. And now, I wonder, what has happened with Anne? Well, let's go back about 2 weeks before this trial to April 29th, 1536. So Anne, set the scene. We are in Anne's chambers, and there are a lot of her ladies in waiting and a handful of men. There's a man named Mark Smeaton who's a musician, and he's playing some instruments in the corner. And she began to tease the men of her court, as was her responsibility as queen in playing this part of courtly love. So Mark Smeaton, the musician, got most of her attention that day. He appeared to have a crush on her, and she told him that she was out of his league and there was absolutely no chance. You, sir, are a musician, not a nobleman. And when she got tired of mocking Mark Smeaton, she turned her attention to a man named Henry Norris. Now, Henry Norris was a nobleman, and not only was he a nobleman, but he was one of Henry's best friends for many, many years. And he had been appointed a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, which basically meant that he would attend to the king in private. He was one of very few men who was allowed into the king's private chambers. It said that these men were super influential, and it was one of the greatest honors to become a man of the privy chamber, because it meant that the king respected you and trusted you and held you in high esteem. And these men often had more sway over the king than his wife. And Henry Norris had one of the highest honors of being groom of the stool, which meant that he got to wipe Henry VIII's ass every time he took a shit. But this was considered an honor, so. Man, royal court was weird. But anyway, back to Anne. So she turned her attention to Henry Norris because earlier in the month, a man named Francis Weston had told her that maybe Norris had a little bit of a crush on her. So Anne asked Norris why he hadn't gotten married yet. And when he responded, whatever he responded, like, I'm just not ready yet, not ready to settle down, oh, the old ball and chain, whatever. She told him that she thinks that he desires her and he looks for dead man's shoes, and that if anything bad happens to Henry VIII, that he would try to marry her. And she said this in front of everyone. Like I said, flirting was normal behavior. She was expected to flirt with everyone. But what she actually just did was commit high treason. To imagine the king's death and then put it into words was treason during this time. And to say that Henry Norris was looking for dead man's shoes was saying that Henry Norris was waiting for the king to die so that he could swoop in and have Anne all for himself. Henry Norris immediately caught on to what she was saying and basically responded that he would rather have his head cut off than think such thoughts, which is slightly foreshadowing. And then Anne realized what was happening, and because she did this in front of a bunch of people, people started gossiping. And wouldn't you know, Thomas Cromwell heard about this, and he went to Henry VIII and told him what the queen had been saying, and that the queen had been acting freely with men from court, that they whispered sweet nothings to each other, and maybe there could have been a little bit more to this. She may have been having a little bit of extramarital fun, if you get my drift. Yeah, he said that she was fucking Henry Norris and pretty much everyone else in the court. Now, the problem with this is one, I mean, first and foremost, it would emasculate and humiliate the king and make him into a cuckold. And I realize that that word has been thrown around a lot lately as like an insult, especially by like right-wing conservatives, but that's literally what he would have been called by people. Shakespeare is full of cuck jokes and also cock jokes. That man was dirty, and it's one of the reasons why I love him. But furthermore, if the queen was being an adulteress, then he couldn't know for sure if any future children that they had were legitimate or if Elizabeth was legitimate. And it was totally fine for the king to have extramarital affairs. In fact, it was almost expected, but those children, I mean, didn't have to be recognized, you know? And it was even better if the king had slept with women who were already married, like Anne Boleyn, so that he could sort of just like, these children aren't his problem, you know? But when it was the queen, that was a big deal. We're talking about lines of succession, and we couldn't possibly have someone on the throne who wasn't blood of the king. Adoption was not a thing, friends. So Cromwell and the king conspired to begin investigating this. They created a court of warrior interpreter, which is basically a committee that is put together to just look into one criminal matter. We talked about this before when we talked about the Salem witch trials. They also created a court of warrior interpreter to look just into the witch trials. Now, in some accounts that I read that push that Thomas Cromwell and Anne Boleyn hated each other because they used to fight, say he saw this as a perfect opportunity to get rid of her. But these stories were written during Queen Elizabeth's rule, which makes me question how reliable they are. Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne and Henry, and if she was looking for someone to kind of place the blame on, she wasn't going to outright blame her father for what happens later to her mother, but she can blame his right-hand man, Thomas Cromwell. Other accounts, like from Eustace Shapley, who, again, is sort of like notorious for not liking the concubine, quote-unquote, Anne Boleyn, wrote something very different. Now, remember earlier, it's said that in January 1536, Henry VIII took a notice to Jane Seymour, right around the same time that Anne had her miscarriage. So let's take that and think about it and take it a little bit further. Let's do some critical thinking skills. So if Anne was born in 1500 or 1501, like most historians agree, then she would have been in her mid-30s. And if we remember in 1518, Catherine was in her mid-30s and had had a miscarriage. And the chances of her getting pregnant again were most likely slim. And that's when he started looking for a younger and more fertile woman. And he already had one in mind. In this case, it was Bessie Blount, and she had Henry Fitzroy. And then later on, Anne Boleyn came into the picture. She became the mistress or whatever. And then she became the wife. Henry VIII also went into overdrive. He basically started a smear campaign against Anne. Where have we seen this before? He said that she slept with over 100 men and he was grateful to be free of her. And then he accused her of being a witch, that she must have bewitched him, and it was her fault that he divorced Catherine of Aragon, and it was her fault that he succumbed to her, and he was just an innocent victim in all of this. So is history repeating itself? Eustace Shapley seemed to kind of think that and hint towards that. He said that Thomas Cromwell seemed to orchestrate these accusations, which might align with what we've said, but Shapley takes it even further. And he says that around April 18th, 1536, Henry VIII had given Cromwell orders to figure out how to get him out of his marriage. And then conveniently, 11 days later, this offhand comment fell into their lap, and now they have their smoking gun. The idea that Cromwell was put up to it is also confirmed kind of when you look into how Thomas Cromwell was trying to look into annulling the marriage on the grounds that she was previously in a marriage contract with Henry Percy, who had said multiple times that this had never happened, and he had to look into other ways to end the marriage, like Henry VIII asked. So again, this court of warrior interpreter begins their investigation. Mark Smeaton, the musician that she was flirting with on the day in question, was one of the first to be interrogated. And there are a lot of thoughts about this. A lot of people think that Thomas Cromwell allegedly tortured him into these confessions that he gives. Allegedly, I mean, for entertainment purposes, we don't know for sure. But after a while, he did say, quote, "The queen took me to her bed, and she gave into my passions 3 times. And then he was told to give the names of other men that she had slept with as well, like he would fucking know." And I find this really interesting. Again, I sort of mentioned Court of Warrior Interpreter with the Salem witch trials. Again, I'm reminded again with the Salem witch trials and just like the witch trials that happened later in England and how they would question people and get their answers however necessary. And then that person was expected to give more and more names. On May 10th, 1536, it was announced, not to Anne, obviously, but it was announced to other people, that there was enough evidence to suggest that Anne Boleyn, George Boleyn, Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, and William Brereton were guilty of the alleged crimes, and they would be sent to trial. The indictment read that Anne was seduced by evil and had malice in her heart and had given in to her carnal appetites, which, I mean, again, sounds a lot like witchcraft accusations in the later 16th century. It also said that they all conspired to kill the king. Another thing that's like weirdly often linked to witchcraft accusations. There's got to be something there. I'm going to look into it more. Henry decided that Norris was guilty before he even went to trial. On May 1st, Henry Norris competed in a tournament at Greenwich Palace. And at the end, apparently Henry ended the tournament early. And as they were on their way back to the palace, Henry VIII went up to him and told him that he knew and that Norris should just confess. But Norris didn't confess. He said he did nothing wrong. And on May 12th, he still went to his trial before the Court of Orient Terminer at Westminster Hall, claiming his innocence. The jury was not ever going to be on his side. Nowadays, these men would not have been selected for the jury because they were so biased. They were relatively extreme religious conservatives who were all close to Thomas Cromwell. On this day, Mark Smeaton, Francis Weston, and William Brereton were also tried, and they were all found guilty. They weren't told about what evidence was against them, so they couldn't build a defense case. All they could do was react in the moment. Eustace Chapuis wrote about this and said, quote, "The others were condemned upon presumption and certain indications without valid proof or confessions." And remember, Eustace Chapuis hates what's happening in England right now. Upon this guilty verdict that all four of the men received, they were sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. So now we're back to Anne's trial on May 15th, 1536. Kind of unfair that they tried these other four men before they tried Anne. Because, like, if these four men were found guilty of their crimes, like, and their crimes were sleeping with Anne and trying to commit treason with Anne, like, Anne has no chance of getting out of this, right? So she's standing before them. The charges have been read to her: adultery, high treason, and incest, not witchcraft. A lot of people think she was accused of witchcraft. She wasn't. It was just like behind the scenes. There were whispers of it. She was certainly described in terms that were later attributed to witchcraft allegations. But in England, witchcraft was not a crime until 1542 when Henry VIII passed that first Witchcraft Act, which, like, I'm pretty sure I'm going to talk about a little bit when I talk about Catherine Howard, because there were some other things that he passed that year as well. So Anne pled not guilty. I mean, there was no evidence against her. There were no witnesses. There were no proof. There were no expert witness testimonies. There was nothing that actually was foundation against her that could prove all of this was wrong. So of course she was found guilty. She responded that she was innocent of everything that she was charged with and that she'd always been faithful and loyal to Henry. She confessed that she was a jealous wife and that she suspected him of affairs, but that was the only thing that she was guilty of. But because all 26 of these members of the jury were loyal to the king and he was becoming a ruthless king, I mean, he just arrested and found his best friend guilty without hesitation, every single one of the juries found her guilty. She was then stripped of her crown and all of her titles except for queen, and her uncle was forced to read out her sentence. Apparently, with tears running down his face, he said, quote, "Because thou hast offended against our sovereign that king's grace in committing treason against his person, and here attained of the same, the law of the realm is this, that thou hast deserved death. And thy judgment is 'tis, that thou shalt be burnt here within the Tower of London on the green, or else to have thy head smitten off as the king's pleasure shall be further known of the same." So because she was committed of high treason, she was either going to be burned alive or she was going to have her head cut off. She didn't argue this sentence, but she did say that she believed that there were some other reasons that she was being condemned other than what was alleged. She was then escorted out, and her brother George was escorted in, and their uncle had to see over that as well. George was said to have defended himself so well that people thought that he was going to be acquitted, but he was also found guilty, most likely because he pissed off the king when he joked about his impotence. So it's said that like after he had that injury on January 24th, 1536, when he fell off of his horse, Anne tried to get pregnant again, but King Henry VIII could not get it up. So Anne went and told her brother, and maybe went and told her brother's wife Jane about the issues that she was having, and then George kind of laughed about it and sort of like told people about it, and then Jane Boleyn kind of went to Thomas Cromwell and told him about all of this. Like, yeah, no, it was, again, bananas. And then at George's trial, Cromwell had handed him a note that he was just to comment on but not read out loud. And George either like didn't hear that part, or he was like, yeah, fuck that. And he read it out loud. And the note was about his wife Jane saying that he had discussed the king's impotence with Anne. But at the same time, like, this makes no sense to me though, right? Because like, if these impotence arguments were to be on the record, and like if Henry VIII were to kind of have wanted them to be on the record, because then it would kind of like call Anne's pregnancies into question and the parentage of those children into question. Like, why, if your husband can't get it up and you can't have sex with him, why would you then go and try to have sex with other people to get pregnant? Then it would be completely obvious that this child is not your husband's child, and she would be literally like asking for this kind of retribution. And as far as the incest thing goes, like, the only real evidence that they had of this is that they may have spent some time together in her room. Which, like, George and Anne were siblings, and they were super close. Like, they were so close that when Anne and Henry were like writing the letters back and forth that I mentioned in the beginning, in the 1520s, like, George was the main go-between between the two, because Anne was so close to George, and Henry trusted George to like give this information. He was like the best courtier. And now he's being chastised for having a conversation with Anne about her husband and her relationship. And he's saying, like, everyone is saying that they committed incest because he went to her room to talk to her. It doesn't mean that they were fucking. And that's the other Boleyn girl thing. That's not true. Philippa Gregory is probably like the only person that believes, that has like actually looked into the history of the Anne Boleyn trial and all of that. She's like probably the only person who actually believes that they committed incest, especially considering how religious they were. Like, why wouldn't she just go with someone else? Like, why wouldn't she just sleep with someone else? And furthermore, like I said, why would she sleep with anyone at all if her husband was having impotency issues? But after all that, like I said, George was also found guilty. On the 17th of May, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, Mark Smeaton, Henry Barron, and George Boleyn were all executed. The original sentence of being hanged, drawn, and quartered was overturned, and all the men were beheaded, which, I mean, honestly is a lot more merciful. On this day, May 17th, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer also declared the marriage between Anne and Henry to be null and void, which also meant that their daughter Elizabeth was now illegitimate. The grounds of their annulment was never clarified. It simply just said that there was, quote, in consequence of certainty just and lawful impediments, which were unknown at the time of the union, but had lately been confessed by Anne herself. Sounds super legit to me. Some people speculate that it was like the Henry Percy thing. Others speculate it was because their marriage was deemed incestuous because Henry had slept with Anne's sister. But again, nothing is actually said. This is all just speculation. So Anne, after being treated so terribly, was due to be executed the next day on May 18th. So she got up the next morning. She made her preparations, she had her breakfast, and she prepared herself to be executed. And then she was told that it was postponed. Which, like, I know things happen, but it feels incredibly cruel, especially because on this day, Henry gets permission to marry Jane Seymour. Now, there are some theories that I've heard and read that say that this was intentional, that in fact, like, they were always intending on her not being executed on the 18th to try and make her confess, to give her that extra day where she thought she was going to die, and she's been given this last chance, and maybe she would decide to confess the crimes that she like clearly committed or whatever, that obviously had nothing to do with trying to get rid of her so that he can marry someone else. No, of course not at all. She didn't confess to anything on May 18th, by the way. She just had her one last day. On May 19th, 1536, Anne is executed at Tower Green at the Tower of London. So Anne arose at dawn to celebrate Mass for the last time, receive the sacrament. She ate breakfast and then waited for Sir William Kingston to come and bring her to her execution. And he came for her around 8 a.m. and told her to prepare, but she said that she was ready. She dressed in either a gray or black robe with a red kirtle underneath. A kirtle is like a traditional gown that they would wear. She was also wearing a hood, and she was described as never being so beautiful. She stepped onto the scaffolds and gave her final speech that said, quote, "Good Christian people, I have not come here to preach a sermon. I have come here to die. For according to the law and by the law, I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak of that whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there ever. And to me, he was ever a good, gentle, and sovereign lord. If any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best. And thus I take my leave of the world and you all, and I heartily desire you to pray for me." Now, this is what she was expected to say and do, because if you ask me, Henry wasn't being gentle or merciful or good to his wife, that he tore apart England to marry and then did this to her. Not even 3.5 years later. But she did have her daughter to think about, and she wouldn't have risked her daughter's safety so that she could say like whatever she wanted. So she would have said and done everything that was expected to make sure that Elizabeth was safe. Anne Boleyn, after making this speech, then removed her hood and tucked her hair into a cap. She was fairly composed, although there were some reports that she kept glancing at the swordsman to make sure that he didn't strike too early. And there are other reports that say she kept looking around, maybe hoping that Henry would step in the last minute to stop it. But he didn't. He was too busy planning his life and how he was going to officially propose to Jane Seymour or whatever. Then she paid the executioner. He asked for her forgiveness, and then she knelt on some straw and prayed, quote, "O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I commend my soul. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul." The executioner then allegedly asked his assistant to hand him his sword, but he already had it in his hands. That was one mercy that he did for her, because as she sort of like turned her head towards where the assistant was, the executioner struck and Anne Boleyn was dead. She was the first mistress to become queen and was the first queen to be executed. Traditionally, executions were done by axe, but this could be clumsy and didn't always happen on the first blow, so it could be extremely painful. We're going to talk about one in the next episode, but if you want to look up one in the meantime that I won't be discussing at this moment, look up the death of Margaret Poole. That one's a fun one. Maybe one day I'll do an episode about her because it's super fucked up. So a lot of people believe that this is like one last sort of act of mercy that King Henry did, was that he paid for this like French swordsman to come and perform the execution so that it would be quick. The axe is made to like be a blunt weapon, you know, it's made to be a strength weapon. And so it might not get the job done on the first one, but a sword is a cutting weapon. And if it's sharp enough, it should do it in one swing, you know, and we don't know why he did that. There are some people who think that he just didn't want it to be a PR nightmare and have like the first Queen of England to be executed, have like a botched execution. There are some that also think that this was like his way of making fun of Anne Boleyn a little bit, that she had spent so much time in France that she had become relatively French. And, you know, this was his way of being like, you don't deserve an English execution, you deserve a French execution. I mean, paying for the French executioner is most likely why The execution was delayed a day. But the super fucked up thing is Henry VIII would have had to have sent for this French executioner before she was even found guilty at her trial. Like, probably even before she was arrested, he probably had to send for this French executioner. Good and gentle and merciful, right? Although there are some historians that I think try to give Henry a little bit of slack and a little bit of benefit of the doubt here and say that, you know, he did this in preparation, and if she was found innocent, or if he were to give her a pardon at the last minute, that he could have just like sent the swordsman away. But I'm not convinced, because like, why wouldn't you just then wait for her to be convicted and then her not be executed a few days after her conviction, but, you know, a couple weeks after her conviction? What's the rush, other than the fact that you want to freaking marry your next girlfriend as quick as possible? Because just one day after his wife's execution, Henry becomes officially engaged to Jane Seymour, and 11 days after her execution, they got married on May 30th, 1536. After Anne's execution, her remains were wrapped up by her ladies in waiting and brought to the chapel of St. Peter, where she was put in an elm chest that was once a chest of bow staves, and then she was buried as a traitor in an unmarked grave. And that is the end of Anne Boleyn. So, I said in the last episode, Anne is often portrayed as a villain, and that she wasn't a villain. She was a victim through and through, and it really is just a tragic story for her. Thank you so much for listening today. If you like what you heard because you're a masochist and want to hear more, please consider leaving a review or subscribing or joining my Patreon. If you find yourself in Salem, I am giving tours again. I'll have the link in the description. Remember, friends, history may be watching you, so don't fuck it up. And The Other Boleyn Girl by Philippa Gregory is historical fucking fiction. Emphasis on the fiction. Please, for the love of God, don't use it as fact. I have seen so many people who are like, oh, you want to know more about the Boleyns? You want to know more about Anne Boleyn? Read The Other Boleyn Girl. No! Anyway. See you next time. Bye!